delighted to introduce our speaker tonight. And I also want to welcome two members of his staff who are with us this evening, Aaron Ringel, Legislative Assistant, and Reagan Thompson, named after my favorite president of recent memory, Ronald Reagan, who's Policy and Communications Advisor for Congressman Pompeo, who, if any of you have paid attention, is a Renaissance man who began as a West Point cadet, graduating first in his class, who then went on to serve in the Cavalry in Germany in the latter days of the Cold War before the Berlin Wall came down. I'm willing to consider that there was a causal relationship between his service in West Germany and
the story I tell.
The fall of the wall. You can confirm it, and there we are.
Absolutely.
Now, after leaving active duty, Congressman Pompeo went to Harvard Law School and indeed was the editor of the Harvard Law Review. After practicing law for several years, he returned to his home base in Kansas and founded Thayer Aerospace, where he served as CEO for 10 years. Then went on to become president of Sentry International, an oil field and equipment manufacturing and service company. He then ran for office successfully in Kansas, where he has served the 4th District. He's in his 3rd term. He serves on 2 committees, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and of particular interest to our audience here tonight, the House Intelligence Committee. He was also appointed to the House Select Benghazi Committee to investigate the tragic events in Benghazi. And Congressman Pompeo has just recently returned from the Middle East. He was there on a trip in November. So please join me in welcoming him to address the subject of dealing with Iran in a post-deal world.
Thank you, Bob, for having me here tonight. It is he said, I was running a business and then ran for Congress. I prefer to think it was I was running a business, then lost my mind. But in those 5 years, I've had lots of opportunities to speak. But very seldom do I look at a group and realize, no, you truly are the least talented person on the subject matter about which you're about to opine. And so it is with some trepidation. Well, Bob said, will you come speak to this group? And I said, well, sure. But how about if I just come listen? It might be more productive. So I spent some time thinking about what I might share with you tonight that would be additive. I know you had a former director of the intelligence agency here to talk about Iran not too terribly long ago. Combine that with the fact that now 4 weeks ago, I was sitting in my office in Kansas. One of the cool things I get to do is I nominate kids to the military academies, right? So as someone who went to West Point, I now get this incredible privilege to invite talented people from across South Central Kansas who want to pursue life as an officer in the United States military. We have a big Air Force base, McConnell Air Force Base, right near where my office is. You can see the planes flying over. So all these kids want to go to Air Force, and I try to tell them that's not really a military academy. But if you want to go there and learn to fly, that sounds great too. Not very persuasive. We've actually had some great young people come through who have turned out to be fabulous officers in the United States Air Force too. But I have a group of former officers who come lead a panel, and I have lunch with them in the middle. We do a bunch of the young people in the morning and the rest in the afternoon. I'm sitting with lunch, and one of them asked me about United States policy to Iran after the deal, and I couldn't answer it. I certainly couldn't answer it in the 30 minutes that we had allotted. It turned out I hadn't spent enough time thinking about what the potential role, I know what the ramifications are, I have a pretty good idea, so do you, but I didn't have a chance to sort of think about what are the tasks that could be undertaken by those of us who care about this so much, and indeed those of us that have the Article 1 responsibility that is connected to U.S. foreign policy. So I thought I'd give a little bit of history, most of which you will know, and then turn to the things that I intend to encourage my colleagues to work on alongside of me. in this, I use the term post-deal loosely, I'll talk about that, but in the post-deal world, right? The President considers this a fait accompli at this point. I don't believe that it is. And there are a handful of things that I think we can all engage in productively to get better outcomes for America. I did, as Bob said, just returned from the Middle East. I was in Beirut and the Bekaa Valley for 4 days, and then traveled to Israel. I spent a day in the West Bank, about a day in Tel Aviv, and a couple of days in Jerusalem. I was traveling mostly with the intelligence community on these trips. Just before that, a couple months earlier, I was in Jordan and in northern Iraq, in Sulaymaniyah and Erbil, and then in Baghdad for a couple of days, and then spent 2 days in Turkey as well, trying to understand U.S. intelligence posture for a handful of programs that surround the Syrian conflict there. And every place I'd go, I would end my discussion with the U.S. intelligence folks by asking, so tell me what it is you're spending most of your time on. And in each of those places, in one of the two top things they were spending time on, they would answer Iran. Didn't matter if they were in Lebanon, or working out of Jerusalem, or working in intelligence operations in northern Iraq, they all were deeply focused on the activities of Iran. I think that tells us an awful lot. I think it also tells a lot about the enormity of the administration's failure to deal with Ayatollah Khamenei for what he really is. In my judgment, he is truly evil personified. And the ramifications for mischaracterizing the nature of the man are very real. And I think America has to think long and hard about what we're going to do, given that our president has chosen that. But there are some concrete actions I do think we can take. I made the assertion a moment ago that our intelligence folks talk about Iran being everywhere. I think it's worth supporting that with a little bit of data. And I do that because the media spotlight has passed on. When the Iran negotiations were going on, Fox News, CNN, they all called, they wanted to talk to me about Iran. If you call one of those outlets today and say, hey, I'd like to come on and talk about Iran, they'll tell you there's a cop shooting in Chicago, or Colorado Springs attacked by a crazy man on a facility in Colorado Springs. The media has truly moved away from this narrative. But indeed, it's my view that you can trace a lot of the volatility throughout the Middle East, and we have problems that are too many to recount, back to '79, back to the Iranian Revolution. They obviously predate that in some respects. We've had challenges with Islamic terrorism for an awfully long time that predates 1979. But I think there was an important point made there, which was that Khomeini's overthrow, it sent a message, a terrifying message, that America was not capable of rejecting Islamic leadership in certain places in the world. We all know what happened in Iran in the 80s. We had an administration that was much more serious than the one we have today, but I think the message that was sent in 1979 was one that we are still living with. In 1983 we saw Hezbollah, a place that I got a chance to go see, right? The American embassy there in Lebanon. We got to see where hundreds of Americans were killed. Just recently there was an arrest of the man who took down the Khobar Towers, almost single-handedly. And you've read the reporting that this was a fellow who has been hiding out in Tehran since that moment. And I would tell you, if he was in Tehran, he probably was not knitting stockings for the Ayatollah. He was probably still engaged in the very actions of the very nature of the ones that took down the Khobar Towers and killed many Americans that day. We know, too, the history of the Iran-Iraq War, where a counterbalance to the Shia Islamists in Iran was taken down in good measure. The war, you read, was fought to a stalemate, but nonetheless, I think it ensconced the clerical leadership in Iran in ways that we still today are having to deal with. We've watched more recently Iran's march to control at least good portions of the Middle East, and perhaps even much more broadly. They, of course, still maintain their lock grip on Damascus. They're close to having a lock grip in Baghdad. The most powerful force in Iraq today is not the Iraqis, it's not the Americans, it's the Iranians. I won't spend a lot of time going into that today, but I could prove that out, and I think you would all be convinced. The numbers today in an unclassified setting are that Iran has somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 armed men fighting in northern Syria today. Today I saw a report that Israel has now taken action to stop weapons transfers inside of Syria, weapons that were headed for Hezbollah, the Iranian-supported terrorists in southern Lebanon. Iran at least admits to nearly each one of these, and yet our president would tell you that this is an ally, someone that we can do business with. He wouldn't use the term ally, but go to Webster's, look it up, and our behavior would reflect that these are a group of men that have more than just shared interest, but a shared desire in an outcome, right? The outcome is for our president to have them re-enter the community of nations. It's a fool's errand at best, and at worst, it is devastatingly bad for the outcomes that will happen here in the United States. I've seen different numbers in Iraq, but the number of folks that the Shia militias and the PMC have trained there in Iraq far exceeds the number of folks that the United States has trained in Iraq. When I was in Baghdad, I remember asking the question, like, how far do I have to leave? I was in what's the former Green Zone at this point in Baghdad. How far do I have to go to find the Iranian leadership? And this was obviously an informal setting. They'd say, oh, just go to the second floor of the building you're on, grab a pair of binoculars and look around. Our president doesn't talk about the fact that Iran today is the primary motive force for what's taking place and the difficulties that America has found in Iraq since the departure of the United States forces in December of 2011. So I talked about the current clerical leader there. I said I thought he was evil. I mean, he is a vicious fanatic. They call for the destruction of the great Satan. They make no mistake about their willingness to cut off hands, and the way they treat women is well known. We've also watched as they have imprisoned at least 4 Americans, all of whose names you could probably rip off the top of your tongue. I'm not convinced that our president could do the same. I can assure you that while our president says that in the negotiations with Iran that this was raised at every meeting, anybody ever been in one of those? It was a perfunctory opening to the meeting, probably began with a handshake, and then the perfunctory opening statements, and then they got down to negotiations, and those negotiations did not include efforts to return these Americans to the United States, in spite of the fact that they're held by the terrorist regime. Just before we left, on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, on the Friday before Thanksgiving, we voted on a piece of legislation to try and stop Syrian refugees from coming into this country until at least such time as we could identify the risks connected to their entrance. And that's great, and we did the right thing. I voted for it. There's much more work to do. But none of that gets to the root of the challenge. Right? The root of the challenge is that this president stood by while Syria burned. The 6 million displaced peoples, half of whom are refugees, half of whom are internally displaced, are a direct result of this president's failure to take a set of actions that I think at the time would have been relatively simple, supported by enormous numbers of people all around the world of every faith, and this president simply sat by and watched, or worse. And the worse, in my judgment, was making it very clear that he had desired a shift in power, that he was desirous of the fact that Iran would continue to grow and increase its scope and influence in the Middle East, and this was not only an outcome that he was willing to tolerate, but one that he was willing to promote. And I don't say that lightly. That's a sharp accusation, but nonetheless the evidence absolutely bears that out. When I was in Beirut, it's a dysfunctional government, right? In Lebanon today there's no president, they don't have any capacity to even have parliament meet, they can't pick up the trash. And when you would talk, I think I met with everybody who believes they're going to be the next president. It's a good thing I had multiple days, because it's a very long list of people. But every one of them would tell you that at the very core of their challenge isn't simply Hezbollah, that's a problem. It's the resources that are provided to Hezbollah by Iran. And it's Iran meddling in their internal politics that has prevented them from figuring a way forward for themselves. A nation that for an awfully long time didn't have Jeffersonian democracy by any measure, but had a stable, capable government that could promote a banking system that worked and an economy that was passable in spite of the challenges that the nation faced. And yet today, a pure stalemate directly as a result of Iranian influence. I had left about 30 hours before a bomb went off, not far from the road that I drove back. I flew commercial into Beirut International. My son thinks it was, it's not the dumbest thing. There are many dumber things. I remember I grounded him for 2 months once, and I know he would rank that one. Traveling to Beirut too. But you could see the challenge that they're going to continue to face. The capacity now for Lebanon to move forward with Iranian obstinance is near zero. In Israel, all anyone wanted to talk about was Iran. There were terror incidents going on, there were knifings taking place. The Israelis are highly confident that they can figure their way through the problem of that magnitude. They're convinced that if they could get the Iranians out from meddling on behalf of the Palestinians in the West Bank and providing resources into the West Bank, that they could keep this from becoming the third Intifada or the Intifada 2.5. But they know this isn't an isolated incident, that whether it's Hamas in Gaza receiving funding or the Iranians providing direct support into the West Bank, very, very difficult for them to figure out how to keep the lid on. They have done it to date. I had a handful of time to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I was there. I was the only member of Congress traveling. It's very kind of him to take some time out of his schedule to spend a few minutes with one member of Congress. But our entire conversation was dominated about the agreement between Iran. We know he was against it. He certainly thinks the nuclear piece of this is of great long-term danger. But his far and away biggest concern is the terror ramifications that result from an Iranian economy that is now more robust and hundreds of billions of dollars in resources that will flow nearly directly to terrorism and to the Iranian, to the IRGC. Right? It looks like it's a commercial entity, but for all intents and purposes, the kleptocrats of the IRGC will get their hands on it before the Iranian people, and they of course be up to no good. I could spend a lot of time talking about the failures of the agreement, but I know you all know a lot about that, so I won't. When you stare at the thing, the document that was presented in its entirety, what you come to realize that it's very consistent with the President's desire for Iran to continue to increase its scope and power in Iran. Maybe that is the macro flaw of the agreement. It's the premise, it's the philosophy that underlay all of the negotiations that took place. I made a bit of a big deal a few days ago about a letter that I received from the State Department. I got a letter back that said, we've sent 15 or 18 letters to the State Department. We usually get back nice letters that say thank you for writing, we appreciate your interest. This one was more honest. It says, no, this is not a treaty, this is not an executive agreement, this is nothing more than they use the term, quote, political commitment, end of quote. We all knew that, but I promise you, if you go to Kansas, and I promise you if you go into an MSNBC studio, that they are deeply convinced that this is an agreement as binding as START or SALT or any of the treaties that have been executed by the United States in all of history. And in fact, what we have is nothing of the sort. What we have is a failed negotiation and a deadline that was reached and a president who decided to hold a press conference and announced to the world via joint press release that no party would sign, including the United States, that no party was committed to in any material way, and that has no binding force as a matter of international law, even for the lefties at the law school which I attended. This is dangerous because Americans don't understand that. If you ask the average American on the street, they say, no, 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 we have this agreement, we have to live up to it. The Iranians will have to live up to it as well, and if it fails, there's recourse. And of course, none of that is true. It reminded me of that moment. So I am new to this stage. I served in the Army. I was a tank platoon leader and tank company executive officer, so I was a knuckle dragon mud runner. So this part of the foreign policy debate is new to me. But when Tom Cotton and I went and sat down with the IAEA in Vienna and were told about these two side agreements that to this date no American has read, I remember my first thought of, oh my gosh, I didn't fair enough for the meeting. How could I not have known that these two documents were out there and that we hadn't had the chance to see them? I thought I'd read it, 159 pages in its entirety. I believed I understood most of the nuance, and then had the number 2, 3, and 4 guys at the AE look me in the face and say, no, you're never going to get to see this agreement. That's deeply consistent with this president's underlying philosophy. And so for all the shortcomings and technicalities in the agreement, it's the philosophy that underlays the agreement that I think will prove the most difficult for Congress to get to. So what do? Prime Minister Netanyahu and I both spoke to the fact that it is what it is. The president has entered into this arrangement. His administration is intent on following through with it. There are elements in the arrangement which undoubtedly will cause some delay in the Iranian nuclear program. It appears that they are proceeding apace to disconnect a number of centrifuges. Who can be against the disconnection of a centrifuge? It's good. There are a handful of other things that if you stare at, you can say that's good. And I suspect the Iranians will, for the moment, do a fair amount of things that look and feel like compliance. And I assure you equally, the American media will report every compliant act that the Iranian regime undertakes. But the truth is we've already seen, and we will see again in now 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today roughly, we will see the first failure of the process. We will see a report issued by the IAEA that deems to explain the history of the Iranian nuclear program, their so-called previous military dimensions of their nuclear program, their weaponization efforts. Secretary Mano, in an attempt to protect himself, made a statement now 3 days ago, which was very clear. He doesn't have any ability to certify, one way or the other, the history of the Iranian weaponization program, and won't when he writes his report. And so what you'll see is a report that says, yeah, we think we know, and it's not as bad as Pompeo thinks it is. It won't have my name in there. But that will be the trigger to move towards implementation and the relief of the sanctions, which lie at the core of the commitments that the United States made. So what do? How do we push back on this? For at least what's the next 13 months. It may take a little while for the new president to come into office, and we may not get a president who has a different view. We should all be mindful of that as well. We could end up with a third term of the Obama administration with respect to how Iran ought to be dealt with. There is one candidate who was the Secretary of State for this president who is responsible for most of these policies as well. There's no reason to expect that were she to be elected, she would take any different approach with respect to the clerical regime. So step one is always speak up about it. Sometimes I tire my staff. I think members of Congress have an obligation to talk about this incessantly and demand that it be covered, such that the American people understand the risk that is presented to them. I have not yet mentioned ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab or any of the terrorism threats that we face. I don't believe any of them can be resolved absent a resolution of the proper role of Iran in the Middle East. So we ought to talk about that. We ought to ensure that everybody understands how important it is. There are a number of tasks Congress can take with respect to designating terrorists. I could go through a long list here, but certainly we ought to get the IRGC, the primary force in the killing of 500 Americans in Iraq during the war there. We ought to get them to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Treasury Department's done a little bit. They have designated the Quds Force. The EU has frankly done better than we have in some material respects, and all of that will vanish. Congress can do that. We can pass legislation that would make that happen. By the way, I won't talk about this, but I am also convinced that when we do these things, and you'll see my list, I am convinced that there are 150 Democrats who are looking for a soul cleansing because they recognize that they went in the tank for this administration and made an enormous mistake in granting Iran this power. They too are on the hook for this deal. Not because having voted differently on Corker Cardin would have changed this president's action in any material way. I don't know that it would have. But they had a chance. They had an opportunity to voice their displeasure of that, and they didn't. And I think many of them are now looking for chances to do precisely what it is I'm describing here. You know, the third thing is there is no complete map yet of the IRGC criminal enterprise. and there's certainly no map of the IRGC's terror enterprise. We ought to undertake that. We ought to ask our intelligence community and the State Department to map out every one of the businesses that has an economic interest that is owned by any member of the IRGC. It's not hard work. We could complete it in short order. We have to turn their attention to them. Congress can make them do something that is that simple. I was speaking to a handful of people earlier. Representative Roscom and Representative Zeldin and I have introduced legislation that I believe will come to the floor of the House before too terribly long, that will give every one of our 50 state attorney generals increased power to put sanctions at the state level on the Iranian regime. They're not broad in scope. They are not the sanctions that I've just referred to with respect to these terrorists, but they can do a handful of things which will have an enormous impact on Iran's economy. And after all, just like our economy, the better it is, the more wealth that is created, the greater capacity we have to defend ourselves. Iran is no different. To the extent we can slow their economy, we can decrease their capacity to inflict terror around the world, and have to figure out how to pay all those nuclear scientists that they're buying somewhere in the world, since we have such good visibility into their nuclear programs in Iran today. That was a joke. We can move forward on legislation that exists with respect to Hamas and Hezbollah. We can attempt to deny them funds and weapons in ways that this administration has chosen not to do. We can make that mandatory as well. And we can force this administration to acknowledge via reports, saying these are the things that are happening there. It was in place at one time previously. It has now gone away. We can restore the order that comes from that. Not long after the agreement was entered into, Iran also began continued experimentation with respect to its ballistic missile program. One can read the political commitment one way, one can read it another. I would argue that it was illegal. If it wasn't illegal under the JCPOA, it certainly was under the UN Security Council resolution. We sent Samantha Powers to the UN to say, hey, stop that. Very effective diplomacy. We can put sanctions in place with respect to the ballistic missile program. I had a conversation, and there's an Ambassador Mole. I don't know if anybody knows him. He has been deemed ambassador in charge of implementation of the political commitments. That's his job. He was the ambassador to Poland most recently. He's actually a decent fellow. I've met him now 3 or 4 times. And of course, when I read through some of this list to him, his response is, well, you have to be really careful. You could just upset the deal. And of course, well, I wouldn't want that. But he's very honest, right? He acknowledges that this president has made clear he agrees that anything that is done that doesn't relate to the nuclear aspects of the Iranian program is fair game. So sanctions on human rights, on terror, and on all things non-nuclear are in bounds. And my urging to him was that as we move these forward in Congress over the coming weeks and months, that he issue a statement to that effect and acknowledge that these sanctions don't impact the nuclear deal. He said he'd take that under consideration, but was very open to say, to the extent these don't impact the nuclear program there, we view this as reasonable. It is the case that this administration has put sanctions on a handful of folks post-deal that are good. They're steps forward. They were small, they were micro, but the administration has taken some incremental sanctions on Iranian terror. This is good. And we should reward the administration. We should thank them for that. We should issue press releases and talk about the things that they do that are good. There's a series of sanctions that already exist today on the IRGC. They're about to expire. We should reimpose them or extend them, however you want to consider it. In my role on the Intelligence Committee, I am about 2/3 of the way of putting in place a review process that I hope will be sufficiently rigorous, where we will demand near real-time information from the intelligence community that tells us what they know and what they don't know about Iran's compliance with the agreement. Much of that ought to be able to be performed in an unclassified setting, and I hope that we'll be able to do that. Some of it won't. Some of these will reveal particular methods or sources, and we will have to do this in a classified setting, but make no mistake, Congress in its oversight role has a duty to continue to take the list of political commitments that this administration claims were made and hold the Iranians accountable to them. If we can achieve that, it will be a good term. It's not the magic elixir, right? So let's be clear. No commitments were made with respect to undeclared nuclear locations. There's a process that everyone talked about being 24 days, and they'll be able to go in and actually look at an undeclared site after 3 weeks and 3 days. But the truth of the matter is, anybody who spent any time with the intelligence community realizes the folly. Who's going to turn over? So you have to provide the basis for your claim that there's an activity that you'd like to go take a look at that. Who's going to turn that over? I hope the administration won't turn over this information. They won't share it with me. I would hope they wouldn't share it with the Iranian regime and say, hey, we know you're doing this and here's how we know it. And so the provisions about inspecting undeclared sites are virtually impossible to enforce. And we ought to continue as the Article 1 overseer to call them out each time that happens. The last thing we have to speak about a lot is enforcing existing sanctions. Sometimes this is overlooked. There's a long list of places this administration, and frankly the administration before it too, has turned its head. And for a series of reasons, some prudential, others philosophical, chosen not to enforce existing agreements. That time is over. Our deal is made. We have the arrangement that the president so desperately wanted, and we ought not now to have any reason to look the other way with respect to a particular activity. The two last places we should look for things that Article 1 can do are first to the Iranian banks. We know that our Treasury has done important work around the world in fighting against radical Islamic terrorism and been able to cut off money flows and identify bad guys through their efforts to move money around the world. The Iranian banks too are about to have sanctions lifted from them. We ought to reimpose those sanctions because those banks are deeply connected to terror, and we ought to make sure that this administration reports each time one of those formally designated banks engages in terror activities as well. These are simple tasks, and if we can continue to keep pressure on the banks, we accomplish a secondary mission. The secondary mission for this work from Article 1 over the next 13 months is to the extent possible, keep the Europeans from investing in Iran. It's a difficult task. They are chomping at the bit. Good luck. Go. You can try to find a hotel room in Tehran. It is very, very difficult. The Germans are there. The French are there. The Brits have been and continue to be there. But to the extent we can make their general counsel very nervous about issuing an opinion on a long-term investment in Iran, we will have achieved an important goal. If we can slow the rush to make a little bit of money from a radical clerical regime, we give this next president a chance to go unwind this deal. And I use that term carefully. We've had presidential candidates say lots of things about what they're going to do on day one. Good luck. It's a little trickier than that. But to the extent we can keep capital from flowing to Iran, we accomplish not only the mission of keeping money out of the hands of terrorists, but we give this next president increased flexibility as he or she moves forward. And lastly, we shouldn't forget that this agreement was arranged by President Obama and someone. I don't know who the counterparty is. I don't know who we entered into this agreement with. It's not in the document. None of you have ever done this before, by the way. When you signed a mortgage, you know exactly who your lender is. There's a legal name on there. Every agreement you've ever entered has been an executed document, and it's very detailed, the legal counterparty. And this one, I don't know. I don't know if it's just the Ayatollah. I don't know if it was Rouhani. I don't know who we struck this deal with. But I know it wasn't the Iranian people. I know that there is still opportunity there, opportunity that this president cast aside in 2009. And we ought to not forget that there are a group of folks inside that country who desperately want something very different than what Rouhani and Khamenei want. And I think, by the way, I don't distinguish as between the two of them. I think the leadership there is all together and wants the same thing. I think their fights and their disagreements and the things they tell us about hardliners, I think they're all the same. I think they all want the same thing. They want more money in their pocket and more terror around the world. That's who the counterparty is. It's somewhere in that mix. But if we keep an eye on the Iranian people. We have an opportunity somewhere down the road to go do what we ultimately need to do, which is twofold. The first is to continue to keep the capacity to take out their nuclear program at the appropriate point. Congress has an enormous role in that. That's funding our defense establishment in a way that it continues to have the technology and capability to do that, and to ensure that the Israelis still have the capacity to accomplish that mission if our president simply doesn't have the temerity to execute a program that is important, that is keeping Iran from having a nuclear weapon. And finally, it gives us the chance to ultimately get to the finish line, which is the abolition of the current regime. The only way, and I've seen folks talk about taking out the nuclear program. I've heard experts say it'll only push them back 2 years. I've seen others that say it will push them back 5 years. I don't know how long it pushes them back. It depends how many of their nuclear engineers you can find, right? So a lot of this isn't hardware, it's human ingenuity. By the way, we should know who those folks are too. But at the end of the day, they can rebuild that human ingenuity as well. And it's going to take a leadership, a regime with a different intention than the one that currently controls Iran, and we can have an important role in making sure the opportunity for regime change exists. I think Congress can continue to push and talk about it and help us achieve that end at the time that is most appropriate. I'll close with this thought. So there's challenges all across the world today. I was in Ukraine not terribly long ago, and you can see Russian advance there. There are problems in Indonesia, there are problems in lots of places that we could all identify. I put the near-term threat far and away the greatest from what's going on in Iran today. It tops my list. I've heard smart people say Mexico presents the greatest threat. I've heard others say that the greatest threats are from Russia, from China. I think those all are things we've got a ton of work to do on. But today, in the short run, if you're looking about the threat that implicates my job is to keep the people of Kansas Fourth Congressional District safe. The best place to go push, the best leverage that we can achieve in Congress is to work towards an ultimate change in Iran, and I am dedicated to doing that. And with that, I am happy to take questions or have you all tell me how wrong I am. I prefer questions. Yeah.
I was particularly interested in your comment, this notion that states might have the power to impose sanction at the state level. Realistically, how many do you think would? Do you have any sense of that?
So I think the number today, is 30. I think there are 30 states that already have some level of sanctions. Some of them are pretty weak. So there's work to do even in many of those 30 states as well. I'll bet there are 24 where good work at the state level could go increase the capacity to deny Iran resources. That is, we could either take them from nothing to something important or take them from a low level of sanctions that exist today. What we have to make sure is this administration will attempt to say they are preemptive, that this agreement was preemptive. There's a long legal doctrine about how that works. That I don't think a press release qualifies for that. But there'll be a legal fight that comes with it. But it is also salutary to have this debate in the states as well, right? To have attorneys general and governors and state legislators talking about Iran is a megaphone that no one member of Congress can possibly achieve. So the sanctions are important as the primary objective. The secondary objective of keeping Iran top of mind for our citizenry, I think, is a close second. Yes, sir.
A good example would be California about 10 years ago.
Louder, Larry.
Oh, I'm sorry. A model to follow, perhaps, was Iran's relationship with the state of California and investments and exchange of finances between the retirement of California public officials and Iran. And an Iranian American who had been tortured in Iran, in prison, a friend of mine, was the architect of that with a California state senator named Joel. I could give the details for you. His first name is Joel. And it worked. It forced the state to disassociate any relationship with Iran, involving tens of millions of dollars. That's a real path to follow.
No, it's important, and I'm personally gonna go to the next Attorney General's conference. I think I've got a slot to go speak to them and talk to the Attorney Generals directly about the things they can do, provide them a model legislation to try and help them achieve it and help them know how to talk about it as well.
I wanted to take the opportunity to commend you for your engagement in this issue and all the related issues, traveling, speaking, meeting. I wanted to ask you a couple of things. Did you gain any insight on the attitude of the Sunni world, the mystery of Obama, vis-a-vis the Sunni world? I thought he was our friend. He supposedly engaged in Libya, Egypt, other places to promote the Arab Spring. Then all of a sudden, he becomes Iran's friend. How does the Sunni world see that? And number two,
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I drove back from Atlanta. I just switched and came here, so I had some time to listen to the radio today. And I heard some feedback from the hearings and the announcement that they're going to be sending some more special forces over to Syria. Following that announcement, the radio commentator made the announcement that the Iranian National Guard specifically stated, we will target those special forces people. Here we have Shia forces stating publicly they're going to go after American special forces as soon as they touch the ground.
Yeah.
So maybe you can add some context to that.
So I don't know that I have I'm unsurprised that that statement was made. Troubled, but unsurprised that they made it. It wouldn't.
Sunnis should
So
stop bombing.
that's right. That's exactly right. So that's right. They have. So I'm happy to advocate for putting more forces in to defeat ISIS. If somebody said that's the tactical objective. But you have to have a strategy before you can put in people, right? It doesn't do any good to throw resources when you don't know what the answer is that your desires of achieving. This president hasn't a clue, other than the one that we've been talking about tonight.
So what is Iran saying when
Yeah.
they say we're going to target them as soon as they touch the ground? And what does the Sunni world think about this whole switch?
So I met with the only contact I had with Sunni leaders was in Lebanon. On this last trip, I did meet with Sunni leaders in Iraq as well when I was there. They're not of one voice, but if you ask for the predominant tone, it is one of disgust and disappointment. They were all very hopeful that America would lead, and when I say lead, they don't mean putting 2 armored divisions and a carrier group there. They mean be the force that we were at the end of our time in Iraq, right, during the awakening, where we worked closely with them to develop something that looked like it might get to a political solution. Whether we would have ever gotten to that outcome, we can all debate. We can have lots of Georgetown Salon talk about it. What I would say is they are all deeply aware that they are on their own.
You feel betrayed?
I feel very betrayed. Yeah. And there is no hope that it will be fixed under this administration. I think for a while they thought maybe we're misreading this, maybe this is just the rapprochement and it's going to try and build. I no longer believe that they would now share my view of this administration's tilt towards Iran. Tilt isn't even the right word. The handoff of responsibility in the Middle East to the political leadership in Iran. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the importance of supporting the Iranian people against the Iranian leadership. The history of sanctions has invariably worked against the people and supported regimes, and apparently is doing exactly the same thing in Iran. What would be your approach or strategy for accomplishing that, i.e. supporting the Iranian people?
So it's difficult. I completely agree with your premise that sanctions almost always leave the kleptocrats with nice homes and all the food they can tolerate, and leaves the average citizen in the country in a condition that is worse off. Having said that, I don't see any alternative but to try and put that country in a place where the people rise up themselves. That is, to the extent that the Iranian regime gets what it thinks it's going to get from sanctions relief, people will be more tolerant of the hardliners, of the clerical regime. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I think Rouhani is counting on this, right? There's elections. Don't forget, there are elections, I use the word loosely, scheduled for February. And they are going to talk in their campaign about all the great stuff that is coming to the Iranian people as a direct result of this agreement and this particular leadership team, if you will. The sanctions matter. They provide the impetus for the Iranian people to rise up. I truly believe it. There are other tools that we have in our kit bag to help an established group inside of Iran once they have decided that they have a partner. But make no mistake about it, if today you think you've got 50 or 100 or 200,000 prepared to go fight the Iranian regime, are you going to launch that effort with Barack Obama in the White House? I mean, tell me what he would do. He would immediately call for calm, right? He would say, hey, we got to all settle down, and then he would allow the Iranian thugs to go murder these people.
2009.
Yeah, so that wasn't the right response in 2009. In 2009, there were a number of tools that they could have used to have provided support. That there are no guarantees about what would have happened, but we would have greatly increased the likelihood that we would have ended up with a difference in the nature of the regime, if not a different regime in its entirety. We did nothing, and we allowed many of them to be killed and imprisoned, and there's still many of them sitting in heaven prison today.
This is maybe a hopeless question, but Boeing, GE, Caterpillar, a whole host of the chamber are deeply committed to the deal, and have been for, I would argue, since 1995. Various groups, American Iranian Council and others, have all been front groups for large numbers of corporations. And these are no longer just American corporations and should not be seen that way. Increasingly, both their foreign military sales and certainly their aircraft sales have been to overseas companies. Recently, early November, a vote was taken, an amendment had been proposed to have the Exim Bank not fund sales to supporters of terrorism, designated supporters of terrorism, and it failed including with over 40, I believe, 43 or so Republican votes, in spite of the fact that in the Iran deal, there is a very specific retraction of 4 specific executive orders that prevented the Exim Bank from funding these deals. So, in fact, the Iran deal very specifically now enables the Exim Bank to fund.
Most especially with respect to aircraft spare parts.
Yeah, exactly. And we're talking an estimated 20 billion with a B, in sales of aircraft over the next decade approximately. So, given that tremendous pressure of these, and this is very bipartisan at this point, these are very powerful companies. This is sort of, the driver, the engine, it seems, of much of this rapprochement that's going on. And these companies are absolutely indifferent, it would appear, to the possibility of starting World War III, or even have accounted for it in their portfolio of investment possibilities.
So those are bookend questions, right? So you talked about how the people are hurt, and you just talked about how corporations will benefit.
Certain ones.
From the same, certain corporations will benefit from. Those are absolutely, those are in parallel. I think it's true. I think corporations will benefit, and I think if the sanctions are lifted, people will be marginally better off. And the truth of the matter is, it takes a leader to rise above the commercial aspects of this and say, this is bad for the American people. I'm excited to try and help the Iranian people. My constitutional duty is to help the good people of Kansas and America. I think your question is hopeless. So tomorrow, right, Aaron? I'm going to get a chance to vote against the Export-Import Bank one more time.
What's your forecast?
Spend too much of your money. I don't know. There'll be 100 votes against it. 20 Democrats and 80 Republicans will vote against the highway bill to which the Export-Import Bank, I agree, unencumbered, has been attached. But no one will think about tomorrow as a national security vote, or very few of us will think about tomorrow as a national security vote. We'll think about it as love to see us. Look, we're now gonna allow the Iranian Air Force and the Iranian commercial air fleet to get healthy again after so many years of truly struggling. It reminds me, only marginally related. I was in Amman. I think I was traveling on my way back, and I'm at the gate. I can't remember where our flight was to. I think Istanbul. At the next gate is a commercial flight to Damascus. And I said to my travel companion, I didn't use Queen's English. I used a couple adjectives that I shall not share with you. What the heck is there a runway still in Damascus for? And it shows the absolute failure of this administration to understand the capacity of commercial activity to help them achieve their national security efforts. Right, yeah, Air Syria airplane sitting there. By the way, good luck. I looked at the gate lounge there. Good luck screening any of those people. I mean, inbound and by the folks got off the plane too. I assume it was coming in from Damascus, although I don't know that. Claire, do you have a question?
Yeah. I think we've all heard various estimates of numbers about the frozen funds, Iranian frozen funds in various banks. What's your sense of how much there is, what the likelihood of it being released to Iran is, and then finally, what leverage, if any, does the United States have over the release of these funds, given that they're mostly in Asian banks like China, Japan, India, Korea?
So the best number, if I said, Mike, put a point on it, I'd say it's $115 to $120 billion. It could be 5 or 10 billion less than that. It could be 50 or 60 billion dollars more than that. But the best data I've seen suggests it's somewhere in the range of $115 billion. It's going to be released, almost certainly. And I think the United States has enormous leverage on whether it be released, no matter where it sits around the world. Remember, who's the one country's banking system that everyone needs access to? It's ours. It's very difficult to transact anything very complex around the world today without access to SWIFT, the U.S. clearinghouse, right? A U.S.-based clearinghouse. If we told entities that held this money, if you release that money, we'll deny you access to SWIFT, you know what they would say? Yes, sir. Roger that. Well, hang on to it as long as you like. People, you hear all the time, well, the Europeans are going to lift their sanctions. Goodness gracious, what are the Americans going to do? Let me tell you, there's still only, for good or for bad, there is still only one big king in the economic world today with respect to sanctions, and it's us, especially with respect to international banking transactions. Countries jump. When the Treasury folks get on a plane and show up in a country, here, I'll give you a real-time example. When I traveled to Lebanon, I met with the head of their equivalent of the Federal Reserve. He's been doing this an awfully long time. And the Lebanese parliament hadn't met in months and months and months. I was there I think I flew out on a Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. We had lunch the day before. And the Lebanese parliament was going to meet on Thursday for one purpose, for a single purpose. They were going to meet because Treasury told them if they didn't change some of their banking laws, they were going to be denied access to the U.S. banking system. So from Hezbollah to the Maronite Christians, they were going to show up for one thing. It was very telling, just at a very small level. Lebanese banking system is very small, but they too know that if they get shut out of the capacity to deal in the U.S. SWIFT system, the global SWIFT system, which we control, that's them. So if we wanted to, if the United States wanted to keep those assets frozen, I think it's almost a certainty that we could achieve that. But we don't. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your thoughtful comments, Congressman. In the long term, how confident are you that the United States can be a force for good in the Middle East? I mean, even with the right president, we've not done so well historically. What makes you think going forward, it's real easy for us to blame it on the current administration, which I do. What makes you think we can make a contribution in the future?
I mean, I think history is consistent with that. I would agree. There are many follies that predate the current administration. I would concede that. And we could all list them. We'd probably list different things and have different sets of things that we gave a 1 to a 10. I'd give 1 to 3, give it a 5. So we could, but I think it's hard to look at the Middle East and say that it is worse off today because of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. I think I think that argument, Rachel Maddow would make it, but I think most serious foreign policy people along a broad spectrum would give us some credit for it being better than in the complete absence of the United States. I am not an optimist with respect, I hope I didn't convey this, to cure all the challenges that are in the Middle East. I don't pretend that for a moment. The challenge and you asked in the context of the Middle East, I truly do believe that this is a problem inside a faith. And that faith extends to places outside of the Middle East as well. And so I don't think that you can define the challenge by geography, but rather we have a military, political, and diplomatic challenge and a faith-driven challenge to figure out how to contain what is not a small minority inside the Islamic faith that believes in much of what it is we are facing in the Middle East today and the threats that we faced here in America as well. There are, look, how many have ever been to Kansas? Not very many. Most of your soldiers went to 411 for a year. You had a great time. Said Bob, who came to speak on a very important topic to a Catholic community not too terribly long ago. There are somewhere on the order of 50 Islamic terror cases in Kansas today. Think about that. 3 million people. Yeah, a small state in the scheme of things. 50 open cases, many of which wouldn't be directly connected to violence. That is, these weren't bomb builders, but they're funders and folks working alongside to help proselytize with respect to extremism. It was an enormous challenge outside of the Middle East, but yet inside the faith of Islam. Today we have a public diplomacy challenge that I didn't speak about it all tonight because I just don't think it's fruitful with this administration, but I think if we did it well, we'd have an opportunity to begin to make it better. That's all here's what I know. Absent any intervention from the United States and leadership there, it gets worse, not better. The nature of that intervention, though, is incredibly important. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to mention that I've done arms control treaties, agreements, executive agreements, political agreements for 20 years, and nuclear non-proliferation for 30. And you have one of the very few coherent, rational explanations of what the Iranian deal is. I just wish more members of Congress shared your view. But the question I wanted to ask you was, is there really a significant segment of Congress that would be upset if a Republican president walked in the first day and abrogated that agreement?
I don't think so. I'll tell one more story, although I'm being recorded, so I have to be a little careful.
I can pause.
No, I'm fine. It's absolutely fine. So I spent August calling my Democrat colleagues, trying to convince them that when we came back, I knew we were going to have just days. I knew we were right up against it. Calling my Democrat colleagues, many of whom I've been here 2.5 terms. There's a lot of Democrats that could be sitting in the room tonight that wouldn't know, right? I just haven't had a chance to have an interaction with them. I know they wouldn't know who the congressman from the 4th District of Kansas was, but I wanted to call. So I called, ended up speaking to just over 80 of them. And I'm going to use this to get to the answer to your question. I did not hear a robust defense of this deal from a single one. No, none of them said, no, Mike, here's what's, I need to hear a little bit about it's going to delay their nuclear program for a little bit because of certain elements, right? They're going to go pour concrete in Iraq and they're going to go do something at Fort Out. They're going to disconnect a handful of centrifuges. I would acknowledge that, yep, you just hit the peak. Just identified that one good thing. And then they would concede the remainder, and it was bad. And they would concede the terrorism risks, and they would concede all of that. And then they would close, and then I'd say, it sounds like you're with me. And they'd say, oh, no, you don't understand. And the truth of the matter is the political pressure that was put upon them was like nothing they had ever seen before. Forget me, I've only been here 5 years. Many of these folks have been in Congress 12, 14, 16 years. They've never seen anything like that. I had a more junior member who's actually a very liberal Democrat, but a pretty good on national security issues as these things go. And I've traveled with him once, so I know him some, and I said, so you agree with me? He said, yeah, but I've gotten to talk to Barack Obama more last week than I did my first 2 years in Congress. That's pretty cool. I said, so we're gonna see a lot of bridges in your district? He's like, oh, you have no idea, right? And these weren't express trains, but I say that the arm twisting that was put in place, many of the Democrats who opposed this deal knew in their heart of hearts that the best thing they could say was, hey, this president's going to do it anyway. Let's go ahead and not do some crazy vote on corporate carbon and upset our political future. I'm not trying to be cynical in any material respect. They would also make the case that this was the best deal that could be achieved, and they would make various rationalizations. But to your point, had the president declared that he wanted to walk away from the table and couldn't get to a deal, and we were going to redouble our support for Israel and prepare for conflict with Iran, they would have been equally as happy. So I suspect that if that happens a year from now, you won't hear a great deal of squawking from too many folks. Yes, sir.
I paid attention to the news enough to reach the same conclusion that you articulated tonight about Iran. I put it all together and I can't think of, this isn't just sympathetic toward Iran, or this isn't just, cutting a break here and there. He wants them to win, but I've never heard it articulated, and I appreciate you doing so. But I still have to ask you to help me out with it, because, where did it come from? What leftism, or new leftism, or socialism, or pro-Muslim, or, what part of him, or what part of politics does that come from?
You've asked, no, that's not true. I was going to say the one question. There are lots of questions I can't answer. I don't know. I do. About 2 years ago, I made a commitment to my wife that I would stop trying to get in Barack Obama's head. To reduce our psychiatric care bills and all that. But nonetheless, just as with any leader, their intentions and motivations are very important to understand, right? I can't come, it requires you to apply a rational approach to thinking about this, and I, for the life of me, cannot come up with a rational approach for it.
I take a step further. You look at just about any significant foreign policy issue, going all the way back to 2009, the uprising in Iran versus the regime, he's with the regime.
Yeah.
The Russians say we don't want, ballistic missile components in Poland and Czechoslovakia because we have a right to hold them at risk.
Right.
And he's with Russia. A mob rises up in Egypt, and he abandons a great friend of America. And then when they're in power, he's with them instead of the population. It goes on and on. I can't think of any where he's been on our side.
No, it's the data you point out is correct, and I'm unafraid to talk about the data. The data is very clear. Every time there has been a conflict between the Christian West and the Islamic East, the data points all point in a singular direction. You ask me why, and that gets trickier. It is very clear that this administration, and when I say that, a very narrow slice inside the leadership regime here in Washington has concluded that America is better off with greater Iranian influence, certainly in the Middle East, but I think around the world, certainly willing to tolerate it around the world. But if you ask me why they think that, I've listened to them intently, and I cannot with any certainty provide you an answer to that. Yes, sir.
From an intelligence and a counterintelligence perspective, how effective do you see the Iranian regime at infiltrating the U.S. government, and influencing our decisions, and how effective is our counterintelligence against it?
I don't know how to answer that in this setting.
Say good or bad, or however.
I may just take a pass on it entirely. So lots of effort difficult to characterize how good it is. We've had successes, counterintelligence successes, but of course you never know what it is you don't know exactly. There is also an enormous effort, a legitimate effort, inside the intelligence professions, broadly speaking, so not just the CIA, but a broader set of, to help America understand Iranian behavior. So they're going to do their level best to figure out what Iran is doing. The challenge is a political one, right? Which is when we come back and say, oh, it turns out they did X, deeply inconsistent with the commitments. I think this administration will find a way to marginalize that or rationalize away any response. I mean, the idea that we're going to snap back sanctions is ludicrous on its face. It's simply not going to happen during this administration. So intelligence folks are a bit dejected because if they do their work perfectly and discover something that would require snapback, I think they all know too that there will be an answer to that which would preclude any of these sanctions being reimposed. But the good news is the fact that it's not an executive agreement, even does the next president, the president's going to use his authority to waive these sanctions. So there are a set of sanctions. The president didn't need an agreement with Iran to waive them, right? He just needed to write a note saying, I'm going to waive these sanctions. So he didn't need any agreement to do it. He's going to go do it. The next president can equally, about 12/01 on the, I forget which day in January, the third week of January, go and do those waivers as well, put them back in place. But your question's a very good one with respect to Iran. I will say this, the Iranians have a robust effort to target our intelligence folks. It is real and it is around us. You need look no further than the fact that they tried to knock off the Saudi ambassador at a nice restaurant in Georgetown not too terribly long ago. I mean, this administration forgets, that was 2011. It's 4 years ago. Same cast of characters. It's stunning. That's a bad answer to your question, but damn it, it's mine.
Congressman, just, you mind if I?
No, if you've got a better answer.
Not a better one, but maybe just another dimension. When, I'm an old Cold War warrior, as Bob knows.
Just a little louder, Larry.
I worked Soviet issues before I was sent to learn Farsi and became the Iran desk officer in the Pentagon. And when Zarif, so I'll use the term that you will know, counterintelligence, agent of influence, and when Zarif was ambassador, Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, on 3 occasions I was invited to meet him, and my name was given, because I work in an intelligence agency, my name was given to him by Americans who were kind of pro, maybe not anti-regime, but anyway, they were compromised in some way. There was a very rich Democratic fundraiser, a millionaire. You would know the name, and I can't remember. He's the richest Democratic contributor in the country. He arranged a meeting between Zarif and the present Secretary of State many years ago. And